Welcome to the Global West Virginia podcast,
where we explore topics of interest to international educators in West Virginia.
My name is Clark Egner, and I'm Director of International Programs at the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission. And today's topic is FACDIS.
The West Virginia Consortium for Faculty and Course Development in International Studies. According to the FACDIS website, the mission of FACDIS is to promote undergraduate teaching of contemporary international issues and foreign languages, and to provide educators with opportunities for professional development. There are currently 19 West Virginia institutions of higher education that are FACDIS member institutions. Individual membership in FACDIS includes college and university faculty who teach in the state of West Virginia. Part-time and adjunct faculty are also eligible. Our only criterion for membership is that the faculty member teach one or more courses, which includes a foreign or international focus.
And with me today are Dr. Jack Hammersmith, the Emeritus Director of FACDIS, and an emeritus professor of history at West Virginia University, and Dr. Jim Siekmeier, who is a professor of history at West Virginia University and also a former director of FACDIS. So, gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of the Global West Virginia podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Jack, and could you briefly introduce yourself, and then I'm going to ask Jim to do the same, and then we'll jump into some questions about FACDIS.
Well, before I do, just let me say that probably most of what you just read should be put in the past tense, because basically FACDIS is no more. But in terms of my involvement with FACDIS, I came to it at the beginning of FACDIS when it was being organized in 1980-81. Organized first with a federal grant for 3 years. And during that 3-year period, Dr. Sophia Peterson and others who were instrumental in starting it. I was not instrumental. I was involved, but that was all. Held 5 different conferences in 3 years, and encouraged is a bit of a euphemism, strong-armed many of us into developing new courses. I did an introduction to East Asia as one of those courses, and we had other introductory courses because it was all aimed at undergraduate education. My background, I did teach history at WVU for 48 years. It was a combination of teaching profiles of US history and East Asia, Japan and China primarily. And it was that aspect of my teaching that got me involved in FACDIS. Eventually, through the years, beginning in the late 1990s, I became somewhat involved in the administration of FACDIS. And in 2001, till my retirement from the university in 2016, I was director of FACDIS, as Sophie, who was so instrumental and so important, and still is in retirement in North Carolina and very vigorous, was the spark plug for it all for so many years.
Great. Well, thank you, Jack. Jim, can you give us an introduction?
Jim Siekmeier. I teach the history of U.S. foreign relations and 20th century U.S. history at West Virginia University. Now, I've been here 17 years. And I was fortunate and honored to be able to take over FACDIS from Jack and the other people who put in so much work to build the infrastructure of it. So I had the very lucky position of basically just sort of fine-tuning it and trying to make it better, or maybe just saying maintaining the high quality. And then Jack and Sophie were great at being resource people for helping me in that endeavor. And I guess this is getting a little bit into what you're going to talk about later, but as FACDIS director, I and the assistant director ran 2 programs for professors and 1 program for K through 12 teachers, which was, we called it a summer institute held in West Virginia to promote to promote the teaching of international studies in the K through 12 teaching environment.
Well, thank you very much for those introductions. And Jack, you talked a little bit about the early days of FACDIS. Can you talk about, do you know how it all came together in 1980? Like what motivated faculty and universities to create this organization?
Actually, I think it was more individual effort by 5 individuals, 2 representing public universities in West Virginia, 2 representing public colleges, and 1 representing private colleges. So it was, from the very beginning, a very broad-based kind of thing. All of these individuals were political scientists, and they had gotten together and decided that there was a need for some consortia, particularly relating to political science, but broader than that, to enhance international education in the States. So Sophie kind of carried the ball on this. Others were very supportive from the very beginning. But as I say, she gained this initial $199,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Education for 3 years to see what the territory might look like. At the end of that, there was sufficient interest from over a dozen public and private institutions in the state. And WVU agreed to do some of the nuts and bolts support in terms of staff and office space and those things you have to do. And the whole thing was launched. Now, in the beginning, the effort was more toward twice a year conferences of higher education faculty based on a different theme each time, something to focus teaching on and to become better knowledgeable. And so we would invite individuals into the state who were leading scholars, but also who had something on their resume indicating a real interest and commitment to teaching, because it was the teaching that was underscored rather than simply listening to some scholarly papers, which is important, but that wasn't the mission. So this rather drove the organization in the very earliest years. By 1987, however, there was what Jim mentioned, that is kind of a turn to what can we do for public school teachers, because Lord, they need all the help they can get. Many of them themselves not able to travel even nationally very far, much less internationally. And so the public school program was launched in 1987. Again, we got a federal grant to take teachers to Japan in the first effort, which was a marvelous experience, which I was able to lead. By 1991, we added another component for higher education, because higher education was, as I say, the driving force, and undergraduate education was the common element here. In 1991, we added the Scholar Diplomat Program, taking a smaller number of scholars to Washington each year to focus again on some particular topic and to meet with individuals from the government, from other governments, from think tanks. And I know that was always, to me, one of the most exciting. You'd come home and watch interviews on television, and these were people we had just talked with, questioned, and had experiences with. So it was a 3-pronged program. It had some collateral effects too. One of the original members, Mike Strata from West Liberty, put an emphasis on study abroad, and study abroad programs were really encouraged and enhanced in many institutions, as well as international majors and minors at many institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So there were lots of kind of fallout or development or ramifications of the
Mm-hmm.
program as time went on.
And also, I think a lot of general studies curricula around the state required international studies courses.
Yes.
And I think FACDIS maybe had an impact on that as well. Am I correct?
I think so.
You were involved from the very beginning in the early 80s, but then you became the director in the late 90s. Is
I
that
became assistant director in 1997 when assistant director John Maxwell, who had been very important, died. And then between 1997 and 2001, I was assistant director. And then Sophie suddenly decided she would retire from the university,
Mhm.
and it fell to me. So from then to 2016, when I retired, I was director. We tried to do a lot of things to encourage and enhance the internationals. Sophie's belief had always been that, and I think you're indicating this may be very true now, that at many institutions scattered throughout the state, there were a limited number of people teaching international and often feeling a little bit isolated and lonely. And FACDIS was one effort to try to diminish that loneliness factor and to build more camaraderie and common spirit in terms of scholarship and teaching. I want to come back to that teaching. Always teaching was the focal point.
So, Jack, you were directing FACDIS up until 2016, and then I'm going to turn to Jim. I guess you took over from 2016. Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit about how you transitioned into the role?
Well, I thought that Jack and Sophie and our assistant director at that time did a great job transitioning me in because I was assistant director in 2015, 2016, and then I became the director in 2016. So it was a very sort of easy glide into becoming a director. But I want to just focus upon the real importance and brilliance of FACDIS, expanding on what Jack said. The emphasis is always on teaching. But also interdisciplinary. So for our fall conferences, we really tried to find experts from around the country who were not just people who had really focused on teaching and were proficient teachers and maybe even brilliant teachers, but also people who had an interdisciplinary aspect or focus, because we wanted to make sure that they could speak on whatever topic to a very broad group of people in the humanities, social sciences, and even beyond. Even in the natural sciences, we'd had a few people. But as long as it's international, the faculty could apply to come to the conference. And for the fall conferences, we didn't have to reject anyone because we had plenty of space. For the scholar diplomat study tour, we had to make choices because we could only take maybe 10 to 12 people total. So I just want to come back to that interdisciplinary aspect of FACDIS. And also one last thing as well. I'm sorry, one other thing as well, which was very important, was that we required the participants in this is for the faculty focus programs, the fall sessions in Morgantown and the scholar diplomat study tour in Washington. They had to show in their syllabi how they would use what they learned. So we wanted to make sure that we were bringing in, people who are, and we wanted to make sure we were exposing the FACDIS members to experts who were up on sort of new trends or recent trends in international relations, in international studies, because we didn't want, our faculty to become sort of sealed off from changes in the field or disciplines. And that would improve their teaching if they were sort of educated as to what's going on in the area of international relations, international studies now. And please show us in your syllabus how you're going to use your FACDIS, the information you gain from your FACDIS experiences, in a PowerPoint, in a lecture, or a reading, or however. And then for the K through 12 secondary school teachers for the summer conference, for those that were getting continuing education credit, which was part of that population, They had to show in lesson plans how they were going to use what they learned from, 4.5 days of intensive talks and discussions and other activities, how they would use what they learned at their FACDIS conference to write, improved, shall we say, lesson plans, which also aligned with the learning objectives of the state. There's a different term for learning objectives. I didn't write it down, but there's standards, maybe they're called social studies standards that have to be met by social studies teachers, K through 12 around the state of West Virginia. And so they would show us how, they learned certain material at a FACDIS conference, and then they were going to integrate that into their lesson plans, and it would help them to better reach the goal of teaching social studies standards as set by the Department of Education in the state of West Virginia. So
just to piggyback for a second on what Jim has just said, at our 35th anniversary meeting, we had compiled statistics on what we thought, as accurately as we could, had been the impact for higher education, development of new courses, 319 new courses that individuals had indicated, or a basic reconceptualization of an existing course, affecting about 12,000 students in the state. Revision of lectures, there were over 1,000 lectures that were revised, affecting over 50,000 students in the state. I won't go into any more of the statistics, but we tried to show the impact statistically as well as personally of the higher education and also, as Jim says, of the public school teacher element of FACDIS too. It was always important. We invite you to do this. We want you to do this. We encourage you to do this. But now you've got an impact to make too. You've got an obligation. We do expect that you do these things. One aspect that we didn't mention is that for the public school teachers, well, for both really, but about every third or fourth year for the public school teachers, we planned a trip overseas. And we could, again, not take as many teachers as we could have in the summertime at one of the locations in the state, usually something like Canaan Valley or one of the public conference centers. But we had programs that took students to Cuba in 2013, to China, to Japan, to southern Italy, to Venezuela, a variety of locations that really were eye-openers for all of us, and I think were an important expression. We got a couple of basic federal grants again for higher education. One of those trips was to Brazil in the 1990s. So there were lots of moving parts of this FACDIS effort.
Tell me a little bit about how FACDIS was governed. Did its governance structure evolve? Can you speak to that, either one of you?
Jack start, because I just basically continued his and the other founders' system.
And I basically continued what it was already established, which was basically a central administration in many ways. You had to have some focal point for making arrangements, for hiring participants, for sorting out the visas for those who wanted to participate in things like Scholar Diplomat and so on and so forth. So there was a central office, certainly, and we had at our high point a director, an assistant director, and a very important secretary who had a long-term impact on the programs because she worked there year after year after year.
When I was doing it from 2016 onward, 2016 onward, the assistant director and the director would decide on like who the speakers would be and the structure of the conferences or meetings, which we just kept the same structure, which, when we inherited from Jack and his associates. With the institutional representatives, sometimes like I would get emails from professors around the state, like, I've heard about this FACDIS thing. What is this? And I could tell from the email they were at, West Liberty or they were at Glenville. And I would say, oh, well, there's an institutional representative. I'll put you in touch with him or her. Why don't you talk with him or her about FACDIS? So the institutional representatives were important for recruiting and made my job easier. So I didn't have to keep sort of recruiting individually or talking, or telling each individual person who is emailing me the same sort of, go to the website. Like
right.
representatives could do that. Also, the institutional representatives in some cases could be a source of information, like we knew their background, U.S. foreign policy towards whatever part of the world, or someone who's an expert on sort of global agricultural and food issues. Like if we had a conference theme on something, and say, oh yes, institutional representative at Fairmont is an expert in African studies or something. So we'll talk with her or him about, oh, you have any ideas for speakers, which is especially nice to be able to do that, because if they've been involved for FACDIS for 10 or 15 years, they know the system. They say, oh, I know a person who would be great to be a FACDIS presenter,
Right.
Somewhere around the country. So there was governance from the institutional representative, which was very important.
Did you always have institutional reps from the very beginning, or was that something that was introduced later?
No, I think that was an early thing, but we also should point out that institutions were to support financially FACDIS in a very modest way, $300 a year. Although even at that modest level, institutions, as we went along and as things started getting harder budget-wise, sometimes they could not meet the $300 for the year. So it was an effort to be broadly supportive and involving institutions and their representatives as much as we could. At its best, it worked well, but as things got tighter, particularly in this century, there were pieces that were missing as time went along.
If we do decide to do something as a state again, what do you think should be our priorities to start with?
Anything that will enhance the camaraderie and the scholarship and the teaching focus is important, because goodness knows international topics have not faded in importance. Just look at any newspaper or cable news presentation today, and it's a life and death situation everywhere in the world, it seems, at one point or another.
Yeah, any organization that you could found for, professors for higher ed, just as Jack said, get all the people doing international endeavors, talking to each other, the foreign language people, the political scientists, and the other humanities people, whether it's art or music. That was the real richness and the real joy of FACDIS. And also how we could learn from each other was really important. Building the intellectual community was important. And then in a more sort of nuts and bolts, having an assistant director was so important, because the assistant director could do like secretarial things, although we did have a secretary for a while, but we had to lay that person off because we ran out of funding. The assistant director could also do grant writing or help with grant writing. And the assistant director could also do the nuts and bolts of organizing conferences, travel, money, all that sort of thing. So having an assistant director who can sort of fire on those three cylinders is really important, because with grants, the grants can't be the bread and butter. It can't be the foundation of the funding, but having someone who's great at grant writing, it means you could get a grant for a special a special study abroad trip, or a special conference, or a special event that can highlight your organization's activities and say, well, although we don't do this every year, we got money to go to, Vietnam or something like that.
For the sustained programs, it's hard to get that funding, as Jim says, because
it is
a grant for a specific thing, but for continuing administration for a secretary or director, no, monies ordinarily cannot go in that direction. And that is what you need to sustain your effort over the longer term, I think.
Exactly.
Okay. So anyway, it's great to capture this history. It's our first episode of this podcast, and I really appreciate both of you taking the time to interview with me and share the history of FACDIS.
Say thank you for asking me to be on this program, because number one, it's your inaugural one, but also it allowed me to go back into my memory of my happy memories of FACDIS to think about all the things that we did. So it was it's been a very pleasurable trip down memory lane for me.
And I second that. Thank you very much.